24 hour a day, 24 hours a day.
Okay, so that's from 1995, the Nubiles and Layabout. That's the John Peel session version of that song. Welcome back to BCFM's Politics Show with Irish Republican Labour activist Martin Summers and me, Tony Gosling, renamed as not the BCFM Politics Show now. This week, censorship is definitely the theme again, actually, for as last week. But we'll be starting with the bomb in Beirut harbour, or the accident, and discussing the enormous blast which destroyed Lebanon's ability to trade. And what if we've been lied to about the dangers of radiation, of nuclear power stations, of Fukushima, ever since the models still used today, which were created around the time of the 75th anniversary this week of the Hiroshima explosion, the first atomic bomb dropped by the United States on Japan. We talked to Chris Busby about what he believed is the failed and flawed model for measuring the dangers of nuclear power plants today, including our very own Hinkley C. And by the way, Chris thinks that'll probably never be built. Also, more on the mass media, what they are not telling us about the extraordinary release of the Ghislaine Maxwell court papers. John Paul Rice, he's a Hollywood film producer, he says, never mind the Me Too movement, he believes that there is an evil paedophile ring in Hollywood. What about the kids, he says? And he's even done a film called A Child's Voice about it, which has been censored this week by Amazon. Censorship always seems to be the main thing we talk about on this programme these days, which is itself been censored. And Bulgarian investigative journalist Dilyana Gaitacheva, she speaks in an exclusive interview to me this week about her discovery of the arms pipeline to the so-called Syrian rebels mainly via Turkey. Anyway, Martin, let's start with this attack over in Beirut. What's your assessment of what went on there?
Well, obviously, the mainstream media are seeing this as a terrible accident, and they're also claiming that it shows that Lebanon's rulers are incompetent. I see that Rafik Hariri's son has said, we all know that the underlying problem here is Hezbollah and their international connections and so on. So as usual with an incident like this, that's the official level. Then you go dig down a level deeper, and various people like Richard Silverstein, Thierry Meyssan, other people of some repute are saying, no, what this is an Israeli attack on a Hezbollah arms warehouse, which has gone wrong because it's exploded this other warehouse next door, which has got all this stuff in it. The ammonium nitrate which exploded. And also there are videos circulating on the internet, as I've seen today, which seem to show a missile hitting just before the second explosion. Now, and of course, this is all within a context in which Israel is ramping up a war on Iran, which requires it to destabilize Lebanon and defang Hezbollah. So we've got means, motive and opportunity all there. Incidentally, the Israelis have offered to help the Lebanese with this, which is extraordinary because they're enemy countries and they've never helped any Arab country with anything apart from supplying arms and providing medical care to ISIS people in Syria.
Martin, one of the most interesting statements was made by Donald Trump himself.
Yes, Trump, of course, I've forgotten to mention
saying that this it looks like a bomb, and he called it an attack. So let's have a listen to Donald Trump now.
Let me begin by sending America's deepest sympathies to the people of Lebanon, where reports indicate that many, many people were killed. Hundreds more were very badly wounded in a large explosion in Beirut. Our prayers go out to all the victims and their families. The United States stands ready to assist Lebanon. We have a very good relationship with the people of Lebanon, and we will be there to help. It looks like a terrible attack.
Are you confident that this was an attack and not an accident?
Well, it would seem like it based on the explosion. I've met with some of our great generals, and they just seemed to feel that it was. This was not some kind of a manufacturing explosion type of event. This was seems to be, according to them, they would know better than I would, but they seem to think it was a attack. It was a bomb of some kind, yes.
Well, that's pretty clear from Trump. He's
rowed back on that since.
Well, yeah, but there's a lot of rowing back going on. There was and you see that in itself is an indication that there's news management going on. If the basic statements are then rowed back on, someone is telling you, no, you shouldn't have said that kind of thing. We also heard a little bit, didn't we, at the beginning about this having a mushroom cloud looking like a mini nuke, but I've seen a pretty comprehensive, certainly didn't look like that to me, and pretty comprehensive explanation saying, well, if it's a nuclear weapon, it's going to have a fireball. This thing didn't have a fireball. But most interestingly, for me, Martin, is what you were saying is the context of all of this, because what this bomb on Tuesday evening has done is it's actually completely crippled Lebanon's ability to trade. But amazingly, the mainstream media's narrative right across the West now is blaming Lebanon itself and Lebanon's government. And we've even had President Macron going over there. Who knows? Maybe he's threatening them and he's having secret talks about something that they're planning to do and that they better give in right now. That saying that this is the very, very clearly laying the blame at the foot of the Lebanese government for destroying their own port.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at all the things that are being said, it makes me extremely suspicious about this event. Hezbollah had a guy, one of their people was killed in Syria last week, and they generally retaliate for those killings, but they don't immediately retaliate. There's some story last week about there was some infiltration by the Shabar farms, and the Israelis killed some people, but then both the Israelis and Hezbollah denied it. Everything is on edge, and basically it's part of the Israeli strategy to destabilize Lebanon, to make sure that Hezbollah is removed from the government of Lebanon. And don't forget, the Israelis intervened massively in the Lebanese civil war to support their protégés. Well, look, and they still regard it as their backyard.
Even closer to we didn't report it last Friday, but Friday morning was reported in the Israeli press that Benny Gantz had instructed the Israeli Defense Force to bomb Lebanese infrastructure if Hezbollah was to harm any of their soldiers. Defence Minister Benny Gantz last week instructed the IDF to bomb Lebanese infrastructure if Hezbollah has harmed any IDF soldiers or Israeli civilians. A senior defence official told Israeli Hayom that Gantz issued the order to prepare such a response during the meetings on Thursday with the IDF Chief of Staff, Aviv Kochavi, and other members of the General Staff. So, it does seem as if there was any kind of incidents over the weekend, and whether there were or not, the Israeli military was certainly considering bombing infrastructure in Lebanon, and this is possibly the most important piece of infrastructure in the entire country.
Yes, that's right. And, of course, everything is on edge here now. Everybody's waiting. And don't forget, with the election coming up in November in the US and the possibility that Trump may no longer be there, the war faction in Israel are quite keen to get a war with Iran started with the Americans involved and presumably the British, since we always do as we're told. Most people in Britain probably not paying too much attention to all of this, but we will be dragged in for sure. And that's what possibly this is the first what Richard Silverstein was suggesting, who is a pretty good anti-Zionist Jewish activist. He's basically saying that this was a botched attempt to take out a Hezbollah arms dump, but it actually blew up the ammonium nitrate warehouse next door. It wasn't intended to kill as many people as this, but they've messed it up. And that's what's going on here. And neither the Israeli government doesn't want to admit that's what happened, and Hezbollah don't want to admit what's happened, because it then puts them in the firing line. Why are you storing weapons in this warehouse, etc.? But of course, as I said earlier, there are also videos circulating on the internet. They've been taken down, but I've managed to see them this afternoon. They're out there showing a missile hitting the building just before
that certainly is possible, but it's also possible those videos have been
exactly. I'm not saying anything, but people can. If you look out there, you'll see that that's out there, and people are commenting on it.
Have been photoshopped or whatever. But look, I'm going to post a link up on our show page to a fascinating piece of film, and this is it's called A Mysterious Explosion. Looks to me like a kind of advanced fuel air bomb. Now, I'm sure, Martin, you'll be familiar with these weapons. It's called the thermobaric weapon. What happens basically is that there's two explosions very rapidly, one after the other. The first one injects a massive amount of high explosive into the atmosphere in a aerosol form, and then the second explosion will then set light to that, and it causes a massive explosion, and it evacuates all the air, and anyone within that area will be suffocated and killed by this. But it has exactly the same kind of, should we say, dome cloud-like shape, and also with a kind of pillar in the middle of it of thick, dense smoke, as the one that we saw in. I mean, so I would just suggest that people have a look at our show page later at thisweek.org.uk at this mysterious explosion, the film of that taken in Syria 7 months ago, and compare it to what happened in Beirut, because it looks to me as if it's exactly the same weapon that was used. And of course, if you set fire to ammonium nitrate, as I don't know if you ever tried this, Martin, but it doesn't explode in a bomb-like way. It certainly explodes, but it's a very slow burn explosion as the fire rips through the chemical. It certainly doesn't explode in the same way as a bomb does, and a bomb is with those chemicals in the high explosive sealed in a metal container, a metal tube, or a bomb will go off in a completely different way, very much more like this one we saw in Syria. So I would suggest that this is almost certainly, and looking at the circumstantial evidence of the news management as well, a bomb attack. Now, let's just look at the implications of that, because does that mean that the Israelis, without telling the Americans, have destroyed this important part of Lebanon in a way that they may have liked to have done years ago, but they couldn't get away with because militarily they couldn't do it, but they can do a sneak attack and use the mass media of the Western world in order to try and convince everybody that it's nothing to do with Israel, it's all the Lebanese government's own fault?
Yeah, that sounds perfectly plausible to me. And don't forget, this afternoon, the Israeli Defense Forces, their Air Force, has twice attacked Syrian army positions. They've not been doing that up to now. They've been attacking Hezbollah, they've been attacking Iranian positions inside Syria, but they haven't directly attacked Syrian army positions. But apparently they've done that this afternoon. And that's because the right wing in Israel, who are also facing corruption charges, all sorts of things, they are basically pushing for a war with Iran before November. And that something like this would help them to do that. It helps to destabilize Lebanon, which is clearly the strategy. The economy in Lebanon has been attacked, basically, because unless Hezbollah leaves the government, Lebanon is persona non grata in the West. Now, Lebanon have been embedded in the coalition government in Lebanon for some years now. They're in alliance with Michel Aoun and some elements within the Christian community. The opposition in Syria, in Lebanon, is largely made up of the Sunnis and some of the other Christians. Rafik Hariri started to bloviate about how it's Hezbollah's fault that this has happened. And of course, his father was assassinated, supposedly by Hezbollah, but it was actually the Israelis, as Hezbollah proved in a press conference where they showed the video footage from the Israelis' drone, which had actually fired the missile which killed Hariri, because they'd hacked into it. Now, I think it's quite likely that the Israelis either perhaps they didn't expect the level of casualties, I don't know. But in any case, we know that they're trying to destabilise Lebanon at the moment, as are the US deep state. So it's very suspicious that something like this. They're not just
destabilising it by stopping their ability to trade with the outside world, Martin. They've crippled Lebanon.
Well, that's right. And the demand is Hezbollah must leave the government. We need a new government in Lebanon which is friendly to Israel. And everybody else in Israel is going to have their feet held to the fire until Hezbollah is removed. Now, Hezbollah, in fact, are the only properly armed faction in Lebanon. And they're regarded as a patriotic faction, even by Christians, because most of the Shia communities concentrated in the south of Lebanon, south of Beirut, and southwards towards the border with Israel. And they've taken the brunt of fighting with Israel. And since 2006, they've established what they call the terms of engagement with Israel, which is Israel is basically, in 2006, Hezbollah defeated the Israeli army. And they're actually, because of all the fighting they've been doing in Syria, where they've lost thousands of people, They've become much, much more efficient and well organised than they were even previously. And of course, Hezbollah has got battalions of troops who are Christians, who have Christian pastors, but they're integrated into Hezbollah's military structure. And anybody who knows anything about armies knows that Hezbollah is one of the best organised, best trained, basically probably the top outfit on the planet. That's why they were able to defeat the Israeli Defence Force.
I mean, people might say, why, Martin, might say, well, why would Benjamin Netanyahu and Benny Gantz do something like this? Well, the answer could well be that they've had a series of weekly demonstrations which have been rocking Israel for months, virtually unreported here in the UK, drawing a growing number of people angry with the government's handling of a second wave of COVID-19 infections and the economic impacts of the pandemic. Political dissatisfaction is at the heart of these protests, according to Deutsche Welle. To put it in two words, the main goal is get out Bibi. Bibi resign, says 59-year-old Tali Etzion from Tel Aviv. So, I mean, he's been hanging on by his fingernails, hasn't he, Netanyahu, to power. And it looks as if you've got you've got regular weekly protests on the Sabbath day on the streets of Israel, with tens of thousands of people protesting against Netanyahu. And it is possibly feasible that he may wish to actually start a war to get himself out of this bind.
Yeah, I mean, you've got a number of factors. He's got a personal interest in distraction from his own personal problems, but there's a long-running desire on the part of the deep state in Israel to annex the West Bank, to annex the Golan Heights, to annex Lebanon up to the Litani River so they can get the water resources. And they've been destabilising other countries around them all along. That's part of the Yinon plan going back to the 1980s to balkanise states adjacent to Israel and so on. I mean, they basically are belligerent. And they've got the biggest army in the Middle East. They've got hundreds of nuclear weapons, but they still couldn't beat Hezbollah in 2006. Their tanks were wiped out by people coming forward with anti-tank weaponry. And Hezbollah have now got thousands of missiles. And if there is a war with Lebanon, then basically the infrastructure of Israel is going to be blown to bits. And of course, their response to that, to blow up the infrastructure of Lebanon, that won't stop Hezbollah doing what they're going to do. But Hezbollah don't want to fight, nor does the Syrian army, nor does the Russian army, nor does the Iranian army, nor does the Chinese army. But ultimately, this is what's going to happen if the fools in charge continue on their reckless course. I
mean, let's go back to this idea that the Lebanese government are responsible for their own problems. I mean, I don't think that anybody with more than one or half a brain cell would say that, because actually what's going on is there's been an international economic warfare against that country, really, by the likes of the IMF and the Western financial bankster powers.
Well, that's right. And up to now, Lebanon has been, in a way, because it was so volatile, outside powers have tried to prop up the rather rickety political structure inside Lebanon, because, Lebanon was in a civil war in the 1970s, in which, as I said earlier, the Israelis had a very big hand. And Macron, of course, you've got to remember that France used to be the colonial power, and they were only kicked out of Syria after a massive uprising.
Well, now again this week, apparently they're back. Well, just one final thing on this horrific bomb attack. We reckon
if that's what it is.
Well, I mean, I personally, I don't think there's much doubt about it. The idea, if you look at the difference between if you set fire to a warehouse full or bags or stacks of ammonium nitrate, it just simply doesn't go bang in the same way as that bomb appeared to go bang. And I would agree with the the US military in this case. Probably the Israelis didn't decide they didn't really particularly want to tell the Americans that they were going to do something like that, or whoever has done this.
Well, that's right, because they've got an interest in dragging the US into a war in the Middle East. So they do stuff to get things going so that the Americans will be dragged in. And they don't necessarily tell the Americans that they're going to do these things.
But the interesting side is that another thing is that there was lots and lots of film of it. And the reason there was lots of film of it is because there was a fire close to the place of the impact of the bomb, or whatever this was. And so that obviously meant that people would be filming the fire. So this reminds me a little bit of the Twin Towers, Martin, where you've got to have two aircraft hit two towers. Otherwise, no one is filming when the second one goes in to make sure that there is actually film of this bomb going off. That's where this fire comes in. So that could possibly have been a deliberately set fire in order to make sure that there was a lot of attention on the bomb when it actually went off.
It's possible. And of course, with the plausible deniability, Israel said nothing to do with us, nothing to do with us. But as Hezbollah proved, to my satisfaction, they were the ones who assassinated Rafik Hariri Sr. And that, of course, was determined to try and destabilise Lebanon. And we know, going back to the 1960s, 70s, that the Israelis were bombing Lebanon with car bombs and all sorts in order to provoke civil war in Lebanon, because it suited their book for there to be a civil war in Lebanon. That's their track record. So that's the history.
Okay,
so
now also
the people in Lebanon, especially from the Hezbollah side, will be very much thinking, well, this is probably the Israelis.
I mean, this also, Martin, comes against a backdrop not only of the horrific attacks, economic warfare there's been on Lebanon, but also the fires at key sites in Iran that have been taking place over the last few months. So these fires also haven't really been reported. The Iranians have been playing them down to a certain extent, but we've seen explosions at and possibly at these various ballistic missile sites. So, you can imagine, can't you, is that a factory building weapons in Israel was bombed and attacked, that there would be enormous amounts of news around it, but not when it's in Iran.
Well, that's right. And the reason the Iranians are playing it down, and it's also maybe the case that Hezbollah will play down what they know about what's happened in Beirut, is because they're just trying to get through to November without a war, because it's possible that Trump may then be removed and the pressure will be released a bit. As you can imagine, if you are a leader in one of these organizations or one of the countries that are under this kind of assault, you're trying to avoid getting into an all-out war, because that's a disaster for you. So you basically have to suck up an awful lot of punishment without retaliation. The Syrian army will be absolutely within its rights in international law to attack the air bases from which these planes flew out today to attack their troops. If somebody attacked the Akrotiri base in Cyprus, unless it was the locals like Aoka B, the British would then go and attack the base where the people had fired the missiles from or the planes had flown from. But the Syrians can't. The Lebanese can't. There's one rule for them and another rule for us, but that's the way it is.
An official Israeli military source denied carrying out the attack, which is interesting because they actually said, we did not carry out this attack. That implies it was actually an attack. So that's quite an interesting angle to all of this. But anyway, Martin, in summary, do you think how much will countries like Lebanon, Syria and Iran, what sorts of massive attacks, if this is an attack, will they be prepared to accept before they start to strike back?
Well, they'll accept virtually anything because they haven't got any options. They really don't want to have a major war. You saw the Iranians practice. They got a fake aircraft carrier and they bombed it the other day on video so the Americans can see this is what we can do to your aircraft carriers. They're doing everything they can to do what you might call, if you're you're a butterfly or a beetle, you've got all these poisonous colours and you're trying to show them the poisonous colours. If you eat me, you're going to die. And that's where they're at with their strategy. And they can't afford to be silly about it. Yeah, because they're, a major war, it will hurt the Israelis. And they, of course, are sort of, by and large, better off than their neighbours. And they're used to shopping and being able to go to the beach and go on foreign holidays. They will be shocked when the missiles come raining down on them. But, of course, other people in the neighbourhood are very well aware of how brutal warfare is.
I mean, the other side of all of this is, do you think it will be a successful tactic to help Netanyahu and Benny Gantz stay in power?
Well, if you look at Netanyahu and Benny Gantz, it's dumb and dumber, really. There's no real forces or voices for peace left in the mainstream of Israeli politics. You've got a substantial minority of Israeli citizens who are Arab Palestinians, and if there was a peace faction in the Knesset, they would work with them to change the.
But many of these demonstrators are many of these demonstrators are Jewish, Martin.
Well, yes, because Netanyahu's a crook. So what they're objecting to is him ripping off the state, which is perfectly legitimate. But those same people probably have. Benny Gantz basically was in charge of everything that happened in Gaza last year, and he presents himself as nearly as militant.
Well, hang on. What you're talking about here, because it wasn't reported that much, was literally hundreds of people being shot dead. Just simply for walking over a piece of land, and they were shot
for trying to march back towards where they used to live before they were all put in the concentration camp in Gaza.
Which is the irony here being it is about the right to return, which of course the Zionists claim this right, but then if anyone else wants to claim it, then they shoot them dead.
Well, that's right, and we've got US imperialism with its global designs, and we've also got Israeli imperialism with its rather more regional interests, but they are very belligerent. And ultimately, of course, the belligerence of the Israelis ends up with people dying in bomb attacks in Western Europe. That's what it means. They are risking our lives with their belligerent attitude.
Okay, but in the background to all of this, of course, is the much wider conflict between the United States and China, which is, basically saber-rattling militarily, but a full-on trade war is developing there. In the meantime, Martin, thanks for pointing out to me last week about